An entire city melted into dark green glass. Skeletons lie scattered in the streets, not killed by swords or arrows, but by an invisible fire that left their bones glowing with 50 times the normal level of radiation. This isn't a vision of a post-apocalyptic future. This is the archaeological site of Mohenjo-Daro, a cornerstone of the incredibly advanced Indus Valley Civilization. Early field reports from British Indian archaeologists documented the strange vitrification and the unburied bodies, creating a puzzle that was quietly shelved and ignored by mainstream history. How does a Bronze Age civilization, brilliant in its urban planning but supposedly armed with only bronze tools, acquire the technology to liquefy stone? Why were the bodies left where they fell, as if death came in an instant from the sky? Conventional history offers excuses, fires, floods, but those don't explain the lingering radiation or the sheer intensity of the heat required. The real answers are hidden in plain sight, in ancient texts describing incredible flying machines called Vimanas and the terrifying iron thunderbolt they carried. To see the full scope of this ancient catastrophe and the evidence that's been ignored for decades, join our investigation by subscribing and activating notifications, because the official records deliberately omit the most crucial forensic evidence found on the victim's proof of a weapon that should not have existed. Now, picture this scene in vivid detail. You are one of those first archaeologists in the 1920s. You are unearthing a metropolis that rivals anything in Egypt or Mesopotamia. A city with grid-planned streets, sophisticated sewer systems, and multi-story brick homes. But as you clear away the dust of 4.5 millennia, the triumphant mood shifts to one of profound dread. You find people, not in orderly graves, but sprawled in the streets, in their homes, in the middle of their last moments. A family huddled in a corner, their forms fused together. A man lying face down on a staircase. This utter lack of conventional trauma, of swords and shields, is the first chilling clue that this was no ordinary battle. To truly understand this horror, we must travel back even further, into the very pages of India's most sacred ancient texts. For thousands of years, we've been taught to read the Vedas, the Ramayana, and the Mahabharata as epic poems, as mythology. But what if that interpretation is wrong? What if they are something else entirely? A hidden history, a technical record of a lost science we can no longer comprehend. To find the answer to the city of glass, you have to look to the skies described in these Sanskrit epics. The Rig Veda, one of humanity's oldest and most revered written documents, speaks of mechanical birds and magnificent flying chariots powered by the gods, soaring through the heavens. These aren't just vague references. As we move forward in time through the texts, the descriptions of these Vimanas become terrifyingly, technically specific. The epic Ramayana features one of the most famous of these ancient flying machines, the legendary Pushpaka Vimana. This was no simple chariot. The text describes it as a massive, two-storied aerial vehicle that resembled the sun and could travel anywhere at the speed of thought. It was said to be filled with ornate chambers and windows, capable of carrying an entire army across continents in a matter of hours. The word Vimana appears repeatedly, detailing a whole taxonomy of flying machines. Some are described as massive transport craft, akin to a modern jumbo jet. Others sound uncannily like helicopters, capable of hovering and landing silently in small clearings. The texts speak of established aerial routes, complex flight characteristics, and even the necessary diet and clothing for a pilot undertaking a long journey. These were not celestial carriages for the gods. They were described as a sophisticated and widespread technology. But these ancient flying machines were not just for transport. They were devastating instruments of war. And the weapons they carried were unlike anything imaginable in the ancient world. To understand the true power of these weapons, we must turn to the bloodiest tale of them all, the Mahabharata. And a warning: what you are about to hear is not a myth. It is a blueprint for total annihilation. The Mahabharata is an epic tale of a dynastic war, a sprawling story of heroes and villains. But buried deep within its verses are descriptions so precise, so technologically specific, that they have haunted scholars for centuries. They don't just describe a battle. They describe a weapon that should be impossible. Listen closely to the words, translated long before the atomic age, and ask yourself what they truly describe. A single projectile, charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as 10,000 suns, rose with all its splendor. The text is unambiguous. It describes a blinding flash, a pillar of fire that ascends to the heavens. They called it an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death. Impossible, you say. A poet's fantasy? A flight of ancient imagination? Then how do you explain this? In the early 20th century, a text long hidden from the world was revealed. The Vaimanika Shastra. It is not a poem, it is not a story. It purports to be a technical manual. It details the construction of different types of Vimanas, the specific secret alloys required for their airframes, their complex propulsion systems. It even describes what it calls a mercury vortex engine, a power source that creates a driving whirlwind in motion to lift the advanced craft from the ground. It's a lost blueprint for the very machines of the gods described in the epics. So let's connect the pieces of this ancient mystery. We have a technical manual for building flying machines. We have ancient verses describing a weapon brighter than 1,000 suns. And we have a city, Mohenjo-Daro, with its people turned to radioactive dust, and its stones melted to glass. The pattern is there, if you dare to see it. But the most disturbing details, the ones that prove this isn't a coincidence, they are not written in stone, but in flesh and blood. The true horror of the iron thunderbolt wasn't just in the blast, it was in the slow, creeping death that followed. A decay from the inside out. The ancient scribes documented this aftermath with a terrifying and precise medical gaze that is impossible to ignore. Can you imagine witnessing this? The Mahabharata states, "The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. The hair and nails fell out." This is not poetry. It is a perfect, clinical description of the effects of acute radiation poisoning, documented thousands of years before anyone in the modern world knew what an atom was. For those who survived the initial blast, a worse fate awaited. After a few hours, the text says, all foodstuffs were infected. This is another impossibly modern detail. The concept of invisible contamination, of a poison that seeps into the very fabric of life, making food and water deadly. This wasn't just a story. Remember Mohenjo-Daro's radioactive skeletons? Now look at this. In Rajasthan, not far from the ancient battlefield described in the Mahabharata, researchers have reportedly discovered a layer of radioactive ash covering a 3-square-mile area. For years, the people living in that region have suffered from an inexplicably high rate of cancer and horrifying birth defects. A lingering poison, a nuclear fallout echoing through the millennia. Thousands of years later, in 1945, a man stood in the New Mexico desert and watched his own iron thunderbolt ignite the dawn. His name was Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. He was a brilliant physicist, but he was also a devoted student of the ancient Sanskrit texts, which he learned to read in their original form. When a student later asked him if the Trinity test was the first nuclear explosion, Oppenheimer gave a chilling, cryptic reply, "Yes, in modern times." So, what do we do with all this evidence? What do we do with vitrified cities, radioactive skeletons, and ancient texts that read like nuclear fallout reports from the Pentagon? Do we dismiss it all as impossible fiction, the wild imaginings of a pre-scientific people? Or do we dare to confront a far more disturbing possibility? That human history is not a straight line of progress, that ancient civilizations can rise to unimaginable technological heights and then obliterate themselves with the very power they created. The Mahabharata describes weapons so powerful, their users were warned never to unleash them, for they could destroy the earth in an instant. It speaks of a choice, a terrible burden of knowledge. Mainstream science, of course, offers other explanations. The vitrified rock at Mohenjo-Daro? Perhaps just fragments of melted pottery from intense kiln fires. The radioactive skeletons? a misinterpretation of old data, an urban legend. These are comfortable explanations. They are safe. They keep our history neat and tidy, a predictable march from primitive to modern. But they don't explain everything. They don't explain the sheer scale of the vitrification, which far exceeds the capabilities of any known ancient kiln. They don't explain the startlingly accurate, clinical descriptions of radiation sickness in the Mahabharata. And they absolutely do not explain Robert Oppenheimer's dark hint of a forgotten past. They don't quiet the feeling that these ancient stories are not just myths. They are a warning. A warning that has been buried under thousands of years of sand and denial. A warning about ultimate power and the terrible, terrible price of forgetting.